Welcome to today's lesson on countering bias in the interview. Why are we doing this training? In looking at our county workforce, we found that as a whole, we are as diverse as the entire King County population. However, when we stratified by salary range, we found some disparities. In general, the higher up the salary scale we go, the less racially and ethnically diverse our workforce is. King County has long had an interest in and commitment to hiring a diverse workforce, so we investigated why we might be seeing these outcomes. By the end of this training, you will be able to define implicit bias, describe how bias can influence your selection process, and list 6 techniques for countering bias in the interview. We all want to believe that our behavior is the result of conscious intentions and values. There is a large body of research, however, that demonstrates that much of human behavior is governed by mental processes that exist outside of conscious awareness and conscious control. Essentially, the research suggests we are all prone to unconscious biases that impact our evaluation of candidates despite our best intentions. This is called implicit or unknown bias. Our brains use something called schemas. These are templates of knowledge that help us organize very specific information into broad categories. They are essentially the filing system for our brain. When we look at the objects in this photo, we immediately know, without having to think about it, what they are and what their purpose is. Once our brain maps an item into a category, we know what to do with it. Even though the chairs in this photo all look different from each other, our brain automatically maps the item to chair schema in our brain, and we immediately know we use it for sitting. Our brains want to be efficient. Schemas exist not only for objects, but also for people. We automatically categorize individuals, whether we intend to or not. Once an individual is mapped to a category, the meanings we associate with that category are immediately activated and influence our interactions with and assessments of that individual. Schemas are essentially stereotypes. Stereotypes have a negative connotation in our culture, but really they are not good or bad, they just are. They are the way our brains naturally sort the people we meet into recognizable groups. Our schemas are programmed through culture, media, and the material context we are part of. Did you grow up in North Seattle or South Seattle? The city or a rural environment, the East Coast or West Coast, the books you've read, the television you've seen, whether or not you went to college, did you have access to wealth or not, all goes into the programming of our schemas. Schemas are where our implicit bias lives. It's important to understand this about our brains because the research shows the less information you have about an individual, the more apt we are to unconsciously rely on our schemas. Individuals do not operate in a vacuum. In addition to implicit bias influencing our thoughts and actions, explicit bias and institutional bias also play a part. Explicit bias are those biases we have that we are aware of. For example, having a known preference for hiring college graduates could be considered an explicit bias. Institutional biases are the biases built into the structure and policy of an organization. It's important to remember that institutions are really the sum of the structures and policies established by the people within the organization currently and historically. Institutional bias is individual bias, both implicit and explicit, operationalized at the institutional level. One of the common effects of implicit bias on interviewing is the like-me effect. An example of this would be scoring someone who went to the same educational institution you did higher than someone who went elsewhere. It's important to remember that this may be happening at an unconscious level. Another common effect of implicit bias in interviewing is the halo effect. The halo effect would be scoring someone who went to an educational institution you think produces quality graduates higher than someone who went elsewhere. Again, this may be happening at the unconscious level. Our schemas impact our assessment of people, whether we intend it to or not. The more individuating information interviewers have, the less you will be influenced by demographics or your schemas. We do not tend to seek out individuating information. We form an impression as soon as we feel we have enough information and then stop adjusting our initial impression much too soon. If you have ever felt shortly after an interview began that you could tell whether an individual was a good fit or not for the job, you have formed an impression and likely will only notice the information that reinforces your impression. In Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink, he describes a symphony that changed his hiring process from watching someone audition to just listening to someone audition by putting the applicant behind a screen. As a result, the symphony significantly increased the number of women hired. So why does it matter? We notice, remember, and interpret behavior that reinforces our biases. I read about an example of this that made a strong impression on me. Jerry Large, an African-American Seattle Times columnist, wrote a column about a time that he was driving down Rainier Avenue with his son. They observed an African-American male running down the street, and his son said to him, "I wonder what he did wrong." The only thing they knew about this individual was that he was male, he was African American, and he was running. That article helped me understand that growing up in this culture, we cannot escape being biased. It's woven into the fabric of our society. Small bias judgments have a cumulative effect. The cumulative effect was tested through a computer simulation of an 8-level institution. The model assumed a 1% bias favoring men. After 8 rounds of promotions, the results were startling. The top level of management was composed of 65% men and just 35% women. Also consider what 1% is in the scoring of our interviews. By the time we are interviewing candidates, we are not typically choosing between the qualified and unqualified. We are choosing between the adequate and the exceptional. 1% is a very small difference. For example, on an interview with 50 possible points, 1% is half a point. Consider that impact that has on an individual's career and on our organization. One thing you can do is to begin to recognize and acknowledge your biases, including your unconscious assumptions. After reading the Jerry Large article, I developed a practice of observing a person around me on the bus or walking down the street and noticing what my internal dialogue is about that person. What attributes have I unconsciously assigned to them? In that way, I've become aware of my own biases and schemas. Another thing you can do is to have a diverse hiring panel. Having a diverse hiring panel by race positively impacts the outcomes. It turns out having a diverse hiring panel by gender does not. This is because men and women have the same sexist biases as a result of growing up in the same society. Another thing to remember to do is to take thorough notes. The evidence indicates the less information we have, the more apt we are to stereotype or rely on our schemas. You want to avoid distractions when reviewing the applications. If interrupted, we stop taking in new information and begin to draw conclusions. A common bias outcome is to treat individuals who are like us on observable attributes, particularly race, more favorably. Note-taking reduces impacts of pre-existing expectations on interviewers' final evaluation of applicants. Agreeing on weighted criteria prior to seeing applications. Ensuring that interviewers focus on information that is predictive of job performance reduces the use of gender-based stereotypes in evaluation of candidates. The interview team can collect information in a systematic manner, that is, using an interview script and a reference check script. Structured interviews are more predictive of job performance than unstructured. Behaviorally anchored criteria is more predictive of job performance than other types of interview tools. The more individuating information interviewers have, the less you will be influenced by demographics. We do not tend to seek out individuating information. We form an impression of a candidate as soon as we feel we have enough information. This could be after reading the application or just a few minutes into the interview. We also stop adjusting our initial impression too soon. When evaluators attend to individuating information, memory for stereotype traits is inhibited. That is, the more information we take in about an individual, the less likely we are to unintentionally rely on our schemas. Additionally, when we allow ourselves to draw conclusions about a candidate, We begin to notice those things that reinforce our conclusions. Do not draw conclusions until you have scored all applicants. Score the applicant at the end of the interview, and the interview team should not discuss the applicants until all of the applicants have been seen. Watch for evidence of halo or like-me effects. Finally, the most important thing to remember is simply having the intention to evaluate candidates fairly and accurately can reverse the effects of bias. The research shows that if we say to ourselves that I am not biased, so I don't have to worry about this, our natural filters against bias fall away, resulting in biased outcomes in hiring. If instead, before you begin, you say to yourself, I intend to evaluate these candidates fairly and accurately, your filters fully engage and you will reduce the impact bias has on the outcomes of your selection process. Thank you for attending today's training. I hope that you have learned something useful. For more information about implicit bias, visit the Implicit Project website. For more information about the research used in developing this project, please view the bibliography. If you have any questions, please contact your departmental human resources office.